burial places of the enslaved and their descendants. This event is sponsored by the Remembering Slavery, Resistance, and Freedom Project that you see described here. The Remembering Project is a partnership of the Institute for Historical Biology here at the college with support of the Vice President for Research, Dennis Manos, in collaboration with the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Commission of the Virginia General Assembly, chaired by Senator Henry Marsh, and the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities, whose president is Dr. Robert Vaughn. The Remembering Project seeks to bring attention to the humanity of the enslaved ancestors who built the foundation of the infrastructure and economy of the state of Virginia and the nation. Often, their efforts go ignored and discredited because the presence of enslaved Africans and African Americans is treated like that of property rather than as human beings whose abuse and contributions can be fully appreciated. The valorization of European American history has depended on these misinterpretations of African American history. The Remembering Project seeks to help rectify that part of the distortion of history that rests on the continued dehumanization of the historic identities of the enslaved. What do cemeteries have to do with this realization of humanity? Indeed, cemeteries and funerary ritual are hallmarks of what it means to be human, pervasive and unique to our species. So while Africans necessarily express their humanity by burial, we often see where Europeans and Euro-Americans have distanced these people as property by denying them proper burial or desecrating their graves. New York City's African burial ground is a good example of this, a place where in the 18th century, enslaved Africans carefully buried their dead on a piece of land that was simultaneously used as a dump by the English and Dutch industries in the next door. And African Americans today continue to dignify cemeteries. And here is the reburial ceremony in New York in 2003 for the return of those remains to the African burial ground. Again, a late 20th century contestation of humanity, fight over whether that cemetery would be preserved or not, with the US federal government ending in, and here is an old Caribbean funeral of enslaved people, reminiscent of what we've just seen. But ending in New York in the establishment of a US national monument, despite efforts to remove the site altogether. African Americans today are also struggling on the Richmond, now African burial ground, a place that was contested in many ways, whose dignity was certainly threatened, and that represented the dehumanization of enslaved Africans then, as well as a place for their assertion of humanity. Continues to be struggled over, and we will see that story continue to unfold as it seems to be moving in a very positive direction. I should say that also, there was always at least a minority of whites who reached out to Africans and African Americans as human beings, although this had to occur with some sense of contradiction and confusion, as Africans were set out to, and African Americans as enslaved people, to do things that were beyond the scope of what was required of human beings. And ideas in religion and science were formed to justify their dehumanization. Nonetheless, they would be humans. I think the comment by the great historian Sterling Stuckey in his book Slave Culture embodies it quite well when he says that enslaved African Americans defeated slavery simply by being themselves. They were not chattel. They behaved as human beings. And other human beings had to see that to a considerable extent that grew. These large municipal cemeteries do not stand alone, but are part of a broad memorial landscape that includes the hidden, little-marked, and lost cemeteries of enslaved members of plantation workforces. They may consist of areas, little patches left today of unplowed fields with no marker, or perhaps just a little field stone like this one. These cemeteries extend to the small ones in the institutional triads of church, school, and cemetery found throughout the countryside that were the first things freedmen and women built upon emancipation. Indeed, among their first acts as free people were formal marriages and the establishment of stable families under their control. Many of these families included the ancestors on the landscape of their home places. Anyone who has buried a loved one knows that we honor them. Here in the sesquicentennial of the Emancipation Proclamation, let's pause to remember how they did that, how they honored themselves. We are here today to think about these places. In the end, we will ask you to be more conscious of the need to recognize, protect, and report to our website about cemeteries of the enslaved where you find them. And you've all received our address, I think, on a little card. They are our monuments for each and every one. They, let's help this history be remembered. As the Washington Monument and the Jefferson Memorial honor dead people and a living nation, so do these cemeteries honor the living and remind us of where we have been and what we have done. Or they don't. Or they don't exist, can't be found, have been buried. The Remembering Project spoke with Virginians in every region. We learned that they wanted to talk about the history of slavery. Perhaps this humane space gives us a place to have a conversation about difficult things. The presentations about to begin will be filmed by the noted psychologist and filmmaker, Dr. Sean Utsi. Dr. Utsi is chair of the Department of African American Studies at Virginia Commonwealth University and has produced and directed a film on the grave robbing of the Medical College of Virginia and the award-winning Meet Me in the Bottom, chronicling the struggle over Richmond's African burial ground. So welcome, Dr. Utsi. His film of today's event will be available to our community partners for facilitated discussion throughout the state. We don't plan to film audience discussion for that purpose, but we'll do so for our own record keeping, because it will go to people who will themselves have discussions, and so they don't need to hear what we have to say here. But if there's anyone who objects to, who cannot participate in this, I'm letting you know that you should excuse yourself, and, but we thank you if you would join us. We have an extraordinarily high level of expertise today. Experts on African American cemeteries and monuments who will lead us all, we hope, to find new questions about part of our world we might otherwise take for granted. Cassandra Newby Alexander. Dr. Newby Alexander is professor of history at Norfolk State University. She has written much on the African American community of Hampton Roads, including An African American History of the Civil War in Hampton Roads, a book of published in 2010. She's received multiple awards and honors. This year, she was awarded the University Professor Award for Outstanding Work from Norfolk State University. Dr. Newby Alexander received her PhD from the College of William and Mary in 1992. Lynn Rainville. Dr. Rainville is research professor in humanities at Sweetbriar College. She is also the founding director of the Tusculum Institute for Sustainable Historic Preservation at Sweetbriar. She's the project director of the Survey of African American Cemeteries in Virginia. In 2012, she was awarded a VFH grant to research a historic cabin on Sweetbriar Plantation. In 2010, she was awarded an NEH digital startup grant to create MySol, a database for locating antebellum and postbellum African American families. She received her PhD in anthropology from the University of Michigan. These two scholars will give 30-minute presentations. Dr. Newby's is called Remembrances, Commemoration, and the Spirit Voice, Sacred Spaces in Hampton Roads. And Dr. Rainville will present on Reading Gravestones, Historic African American Cemeteries in Virginia. And they will be followed by two discussants, each speaking for 15 minutes on their particular area, but also raising questions for us to begin our discussion as a community. And the first of those discussants is Dr. Hollis Pruitt. Professor Pruitt completed requirements for the PhD in American Studies at the College of William and Mary, and is a member of the faculty of Thomas Nelson Community College. Hollis Pruitt has extensive knowledge of African American cemeteries in the coastal region of Virginia, covered in his dissertation. He's also an accomplished poet and was featured, the featured poet on the Virginia's Poet Laureate website. And then Gray Gundiger. Dr. Gundiger is Dittman Professor of Anthropology and American Studies at the College of William and Mary. Her research includes African American constructions of sacred space. Dr. Gundiger is author of No Space Hidden, The Spirit of African American Yards, published in 2005. She recently received a fellowship from the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute of African American Studies at Harvard University, and she received her PhD at Yale.
Good morning. Can everyone hear me? Okay, good. I'd like to start my discussion by reading an excerpt from a newspaper article that was published in the Journal and Guide in 1962. And it says, 70 eventful years were marked on the past weekend by the Daughters of Elks of Norfolk on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of Norfolk Temple No. 1A, Improved Benevolent Protective Order of the Elks of the World. The event on November 10th and 11th had its highlights at New Calvary Baptist Church, at the founder's grave, and at the dinner lounge of the Plaza Hotel. The principal activity on Saturday was a pilgrimage to the grave in Calvary Cemetery of the Daughter Elks founder, Mrs. Emma Kelly. Presiding at the ceremony was Mrs. Edna T. Hopkins, past granddaughter ruler. Beautiful floral tributes were placed on the grave monument during a program participated in by the Emma V. Kelly Glee Club. Quietly present throughout was the Daughter Elks' daughter, Mrs. Buena Kelly Berry, the order's granddaughter secretary. So it was on May 30th, 1934, that this impressive monument, and this is a design, this was the original design of the monument, was unveiled to a throng of prominent members, both male and female, of the Independent, Benevolent, and Protective Order of the Daughter Elks of the World at Calvary Cemetery in Norfolk. Attendees arrived in Norfolk on buses, trains, and boats traveling from as far as New York, Philadelphia, Washington, and Baltimore, but also from Richmond, Newport News, and Hampton, as well as Suffolk. Conveyances were organized to transport attendees from Queen Street Baptist Church to the cemetery where the program concluded at the memorial's unveiling. And this is a 1934 picture of what was really described, and of course, looking back 50 years later, this important event. Now, why were these events recorded with such care and aplomb in newspapers such as the Journal and Guide, an important African-American voice in the Virginia community? This November 1962 event that I read received almost full-page coverage, with a reporter taking care to recount every little detail, including a long list of the national attendees. Reading the article provides a window into how cultural memory is crafted, shaped, and preserved. Associating the organization with its founder and then taking delegates from different parts of the country to the gravesite where the monument had been erected was an important exercise for the faithful. Moreover, the ceremony of remembrance included a family member, in this case the founder's daughter, who participated in the same way as during a funeral, quiet, mournful, and yet present. We remember important memories from our past as we associate time and place. Examining the use of their segregated cemeteries as places where memorials to their leaders were erected by the Hampton Roads African American community exemplifies how physical space has been used as the seat of cultural memory. For anthropologists and folklorists, African American death rituals, like those of their African ancestors, were elaborate and communal. Associated with the sacred, their rituals were not only about the burial of the dead, but also about remembrance. African Americans used the cemetery as the site where they called upon their spirit voice to collectively commemorate and to reminisce. Yet caution needs to rule when assigning exclusively African influences on African American burial and remembrance practices, especially after 1800. Recent scholars have noted that the deathways practices reflected the effects of both English and African material culture. The communal nature of burial, the ritual deposits of goods in the graves, reflects a dialogue between the community and the gods. While this is present in many cultures, it has taken on a very specific paradigm within African American burial and remembrance practices. This is most visible as the funeral procession becomes a parade and the cemetery becomes a place of pilgrimage with monuments and public programs. One of the most important commemorative programs that associated cemeteries with the life and progress of the community were the Emancipation Day ceremonies, with roots that began on January 1st, 1863. In Norfolk, African Americans celebrated the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation with one of the largest parades in the nation. According to the newspaper, 500 black soldiers accompanied the parade. The procession marched through Market Street to the residence of Dr. William Selden, and that became the headquarters for the Union Army in occupied Norfolk. And that was located, and actually the building still exists, but that was located on Botetourt and Freemason Streets. Afterwards, the parade went to the fairgrounds, which is now where a cemetery I will talk about a little bit later was erected, and that was West Point Cemetery. Interestingly, the ceremony ended with the burning and burial of the Jefferson Davis effigy. And the New York Times recorded this event in 1863 saying, I quote, "Considerable excitement was created in Norfolk today by a Negro celebration. The contrabands collected together with their marshals formed a procession consisting of at least 4,000 Negroes of all kinds of colors, headed by a band of music, drums, and fifes, and paraded through the principal streets of the city. They carried several Union flags and cheered loudly for the downfall of African slavery. It was understood that they were celebrating the birthday of the Emancipation Proclamation." In the aftermath of the Civil War, Hampton Roads would also illustrate in microcosm the emergence of how blacks and whites chose to remember through the Emancipation Day and Memorial Day celebrations. Citizens throughout the regions used public space as important sites to invoke memory, establishing monuments as living symbols around which the community would annually gather. As early as 1867, white citizens in Hampton Roads began erecting monuments commemorating the Civil War, while blacks often used public space as their memorials. For example, you can see it in this particular illustration of Emancipation Day in South Carolina, in which public space then becomes that gathering place. There was a Confederate monument placed perhaps in every single southern city during this period of the post-Civil War era, and that became important gathering places for the white community, and this is also where the Cult of the Lost Cause would then be commemorated every year. Well, for African Americans, these annual celebrations were very, very important. As a result of the Memorial Day being associated with the Cult of the Lost Cause, many African Americans then chose to celebrate Emancipation Day. Notable participants in the Emancipation Day parades were some of the old soldiers whose empty sleeves or pant legs, canes, or bullet-scarred bodies became visual reminders that freedom came with a price. The celebrations gave these once enslaved people a chance to talk about harnessing their resources politically and economically, using the church as their base and relying on each other to make the promise of freedom a reality. For the next 80 years, African Americans in Hampton Roads would continue this tradition that would be known as the Emancipation Day celebration. And while the path of the procession shifted to areas dominated in places like Norfolk, dominated by black churches and businesses, the program always involved a pilgrimage to the cemetery where the honored dead were buried, transforming these individual sacred spaces into a communal memorial where memory would be shared and transferred to future generations. It is not unusual to find that many of the sacred spaces in cities such as those in Hampton Roads were located their burial grounds in outlying locations. In the 19th century, when most of the community cemeteries were established, local government officials regarded burial grounds as hazards to the health of the community. Moreover, city properties were valued highly, and since cemetery lots did not generate much revenue or were exempt from property taxes, the locations outside the city boundaries were seen as beneficial to cemetery founders and to municipal officials. But in the case of African Americans, as the cities grew and developed, their burial places were often private as opposed to public. and of course located in these areas that were undeveloped. In Hampton, according to oral accounts, celebrations centered around the oak tree that was used by Mary Peake during some of her classes. Later known as Emancipation Oak, this tree would become an important sacred gathering place for Emancipation Day celebrations. And even after those celebrations ceased and the memory dissipated, the tree, like many cemeteries with monuments, remained as an enduring symbol for African Americans in the region because its seedlings were planted at the site of important institutions, including schools, churches, and community centers. During Reconstruction, Memorial Day became a time when Americans remembered their fallen heroes. Even though African Americans continued to memorialize the Emancipation Proclamation with the participation of Black veterans, Memorial Day became increasingly an important date. In Norfolk in 1865, in 1865, that's the day that Memorial Day was established. And of course, it was co-opted by those who wanted to remember the Civil War differently. In fact, we would see Richmond's ex-Confederates erect one of the nation's first Confederate monuments around that time. In Norfolk, here, this photograph is in around 1920, but they had erected their monument in the 1890s. And I say 1890s because it was a slow progress. As the monument's levels increased, that, of course, symbolized which dates different parts of that monument was erected. Historian David Blight noted that as the cult of the lost cause gained momentum, it reunited America from the ravages of war as a pure and guiltless society. By the 1890s, the lost cause ideology even succeeded in controlling history books by, quote, banishing slavery from the war's causation. The lost cause also expanded in importance and acceptance with the growth of the national reconciliation movement and the onset of segregation as the law of the land. So transformed was America's perceptions of their past that even the Confederacy was imbued with a cause that was, quote, true and good. Publications of slave narratives touting the loyalty of slaves became very popular cliches. But despite moments of merriment like these Emancipation Day ceremonies as well as Memorial Day ceremonies, Black leaders tried to work feverishly to educate what was being miseducated in the public sphere. Big parades were designed to draw crowds. And of course, in drawing those crowds into the conversation, then the idea was to educate the population. Celebrations like Emancipation Day were important reminders, as I said, that freedom came with a price. And of course, this particular individual was key in Norfolk and actually in much of Hampton Roads in changing the way that we regarded what happened during the Civil War. Joseph T. Wilson was a speaker in the 1880s during many of the Emancipation Day celebrations in Norfolk. And he said, I quote, in one of his speeches, "The Negro is poor because he is not united." He railed from the podium, lamenting lost opportunity and asking, how could blacks ever hope to be free and equal if they did not support each other? He said the former slave walks by the door of his black brother to buy a pound of sugar or a pair of shoes from his oppressor, his white enemy, who has built his store and begun his business on the corner of every street and alley inhabited by Negroes, end quote. He advocated then a cooperative idea in which blacks would assist each other and work together. These were the themes of the Emancipation Day celebrations nearing the end of the 19th century. These themes would continue and morph as a way of reminding people of their past and providing them with lessons about their future. Another individual who was very important to these particular ceremonies was James E. Fuller from Norfolk. He was a former fugitive slave and quartermaster. And interestingly, he was the spirit behind creating a monument in West Point Cemetery, as well as establishing for the first time public spaces, public cemeteries in Norfolk. One of those cemeteries, the first, was West Point Cemetery. And it was Fuller's idea, his vision, to create a monument that would be dedicated to the Black Civil War veterans. In fact, you can see at the very top of the monument an image of a man. And that image had significance that in public memory as the Emancipation Day ceremonies lessened and eventually ceased, that public memory of who was at the top also evaporated for at least 30 years. And the image was Sergeant William Carney. This is a man who was born in Norfolk, and I still have questions about whether Carney's family was or was not enslaved. There seems to be some interesting differences in accounts of that. But suffice it to say that he and his family moved to New Bedford, Massachusetts in the late 1840s. And when the 54th Massachusetts Regiment was organized, it was William Carney who was one of the many people living in New Bedford, Massachusetts, who joined that regiment. For those of you who remember the film Glory, it was a beautiful film, but a lot of it was historically inaccurate. And one of those inaccuracies happened near the end of the film, in which Denzel Washington's character picked up the standard once the standard bearer was shot, and proceeded then to be mutilated with bullets. But the person who actually picked up the standard was William Carney, and he was shot 4 times, and still managed, on bended knee, to hold up the flag. And when the regiment retreated 2 miles, William Carney managed to crawl back to the regiment, still holding the flag. And when they got to him, and they took the flag, he noted to the people, "Boys, the old flag never touched the ground." And these memories and these stories were retold and told again as they gathered around the monument during these Emancipation Day programs. In fact, William Carney would live 32 years after that event. It would take them about 30 years for them to award him the Medal of Honor, but because of the event that happened in 1863, he became technically the first African American to be awarded the medal. And William Carney then is the image at the top of this monument, connecting then that important transformative history of America to the people in Norfolk as hopefully a permanent reminder, but of course, as I said, as the Emancipation Day ceremonies ceased by the 1960s, many people forgot it until fairly recently. This is another cemetery that was created by James Fuller, as he was a member of the City Council in Norfolk in the 1780s. This cemetery would be known as Calvary Cemetery, and it would actually replace West Point Cemetery as the primary site for burials in the city of Norfolk. In fact, it wasn't just people from Norfolk who were buried in that cemetery. This became an important cemetery for all of African Americans in Hampton Roads. It was perhaps the only public cemetery, that and West Point, for the entire region except for the peninsula. They had their own cemeteries. But for example, Portsmouth. The city of Portsmouth never created a public cemetery for African Americans. Even in the 1970s, when officials, black leaders, were trying to get Portsmouth to change that position, it wasn't until toward the middle of the 1970s that the city of Portsmouth simply desegregated all of the cemeteries as opposed to creating a separate burial ground for African Americans. And so most of the cemeteries that are black cemeteries in Hampton Roads are actually private cemeteries, with some being pulled into the city, like Mount Olive, that used to be that was a part of the town of Berkeley that's now part of the city of Norfolk. So we would see these kinds of transformations occur. But the late 1920s, and I want to kind of get back to my story, in Norfolk, the Emancipation Proclamation exercises shifted from highlighting West Point to Calvary Cemetery. Not only were there fewer Civil War veterans participating in the program by that period, but the Emancipation Day programs started slowly merging with the Memorial Day programs. And part of the reason for this had to do with the world wars. After the First World War, there was a push nationally to not highlight one's differences, rather to highlight one's commonalities. And so we would see this tendency pushing those boundaries. But still in Norfolk, there were efforts to continue this tradition of the Emancipation Day ceremony. And this particular one is a horrible image. It's taken from a newspaper microfilm. But I thought it was important to show this because it highlights two men in the center who were Civil War veterans. And in fact, you can actually find comments about them in various newspapers as well as books written about this period and by missionaries who came into Norfolk in the 1860s during the Civil War. And those veterans, of course, Charles Grandy, who wrote a book on his experiences, and Cornelius Garner. Throughout Virginia, citizens sought to continue the legacy of Emancipation Day well into the 20th century. Here you see very well-dressed members of the Emancipation Day Association, the Norfolk Association. And of course, a little bit later on, again, faded images, but you can see prominent organizations participating. There were thousands. In fact, this one in 1937 was seen as one of the largest ever in the Hampton Roads region with thousands. They talked about how sometimes it would take about 20 minutes to cross the street because so many people were participating. And it wasn't just people from Norfolk. Portsmouth would send representatives. Suffolk would send representatives. Nasmond County, Princess Anne County, that later was known as Virginia Beach, and they would all participate in these celebrations. And what would we see? We would see parades and speeches. This is a form of community engagement. Each area then would have proceedings in their locations, but then gather together in this public space. Almost all of these parades would have decorated cars, brass bands, the singing of patriotic songs and speeches, reminding listeners of the history of the Civil War, freedom, the meaning of emancipation. In the smaller cities and towns of Hampton Roads, such as Suffolk, who were devoid of public cemeteries for blacks, the emancipation celebrations used the principal streets that had meaning to the black community as their sacred space. And in all of these parades, bands, floats, and interestingly, representations of the, quote, goddess of liberty were part of this. You would have school choirs, you would have the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts participating. In Suffolk, the Carnation Band performed at many of these parades, while the children from the different various black schools would also participate. In Hampton, the Elizabeth City Council Emancipation Association organized programming that included Hampton Institute, now of course Hampton University, as a key component in the celebration. Hampton Institute was constructed on lands that had been part of Camp Hamilton, where numerous African Americans were mustered into service during the Civil War. It was also the site where the first schools for blacks were organized, and it included Emancipation Oak. Thus, Hampton Institute became part of the community's public space and an important component in what it saw as sacred ground. School officials understood that and provided the use of Ogden Hall as the gathering place for Emancipation Day programming that included speeches following the usual parade festivities that always included a pilgrimage to Emancipation Oak. And as with all the other programs, the reading of the Emancipation Proclamation, the singing of spirituals such as Old Freedom, and an inspiring speech that addressed the issues of the day. And during this period, it usually involved challenges to Jim Crow, were the usual fare. The 20th century's Black community experienced growth despite the limitations of Jim Crow and discrimination. On the peninsula, which included Hampton and Newport News, Black-owned banks paved the way for economic development, while Hampton Institute provided the educational preparation needed for the community's leadership corps. And the community attempted to create continuity with its past by taking seedlings from Emancipation Oak, and this was a picture taken about 10 years ago, and fortunately Hampton University is very engaged in preserving this still juvenile tree. This particular tree, the average life expectancy is about 1,500 years, and this tree is about 400 years old. Yet the community's public memory and sacred space, I want to say, is often tenuous, especially when communities are disrupted by the death of elders and by difficult times such as wars and economic depressions. By the 1930s, many of those who were alive during the Civil War were dying in increasingly larger numbers, removing this important memory from the community. The organizers of the Emancipation Day program sought to renew the relevance of that tradition with a symbolic planting of a seedling from Emancipation Oak. In a 1935 article from the Journal and Guide, the reporter noted that Emancipation Oak was now in a forgotten location. So the organizers had to restore its public memory about the importance of the oak tree by extending its presence to newer locations as the community expanded. In other words, connecting the past with the present. Thus, the offspring of Emancipation Oak was now planted on the grounds of the Booker T. Washington Elementary School in Newport News, naming it Clark Oak in honor of Professor N.B. Clark, an educator, attorney, and graduate of Hampton Institute. Clark had been responsible for the school being the first in the Commonwealth of Virginia to be named in honor of an African American, Booker T. Washington. Even in the 1960s, organizers of the emancipation programs sought to revitalize the history and significance of this tree with a rededication program. Yet, what is interesting is that in other parts of Hampton Roads during the Second World War, the Emancipation Day celebrations really began being conflated with Memorial Day as a show of patriotism. Thus, remembering the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st was slowly being associated with Memorial Day celebrations, with ceremonies including, once again in cemeteries, the placement of flags on the graves of those who served in the nation's wars. And this is an example of what we would see in Calvary and in West Point cemeteries. By the early 1950s, some in Norfolk wanted to reestablish the Emancipation Day celebrations, even though the celebrations had ceased because of the strong presence of the Navy after the outbreak of World War II. Some questioned this revival, claiming the celebration was outmoded and reminded them of a past that they would rather forget, while others re-engaged fraternal organizations and the old Excelsior Band to support the effort, which continued through the early 1960s. In other locations not impacted as significantly by the Second World War, community support for the Emancipation Day program continued with vigor. In Suffolk, new spaces were acquired that would renew the relevance of the celebration. Black schools became an important component of the extension of the public and sacred space because these institutions highlighted the community's progress. Thus, places like East Suffolk High School and Belleville Industrial Schools became sites that were included as part of the parade's processional. In exploring these various dimensions of how communities establish ceremonies as a component of public and sacred memory, using the Emancipation Day programs as an example, it is clear that part of what we are viewing is group identity. With the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, the disparate parts of the black community throughout Hampton Roads emerged as a single group, freedmen, regardless of whether they had been free or enslaved prior to the start of the Civil War. Reconstruction continued to place all African Americans on the same level, and segregation in the 20th century solidified that bond with its restrictive laws based on race. However, as African Americans pushed the nation towards modernity and social equality by mid-century, these traditional bonds of memory loosened, and the sacred spaces became porous boundaries that shifted as the community changed and diffused into broader society. Thank you very much.
Please hold all of your questions and comments until the end. We'll now hear from Dr. Lynn Rainville.
Okay. As Dr. Blakey said at the beginning, one important component of recognizing these sites is to protect them from destruction and desecration. And unfortunately, many historic African American cemeteries, and specifically antebellum African American cemeteries, are lost to modern memory. Their locations have been lost to modern memory, or their significance is no longer appreciated, or people simply don't know what it is that they're looking at. So in this talk, I want to cover a variety of topics, but foremost is how to locate these sites, what they look like, and then their sacred and social importance for all of us. So as you can imagine, if you're looking for an enslaved cemetery, and I should note that most of my comments will focus on slave cemeteries because free black cemeteries during the antebellum period are much harder to locate because most free blacks, because of segregation practices and racism, were not permitted to be buried in the large public cemeteries during the antebellum period. And that means that in many cases, especially for rural free blacks, they were burying in their backyards, as was commonplace in the 19th century, family burial grounds. But then, then what you're doing, you have to do is locate a free black household from before 1865, and you have to locate its associated cemetery. It's just much more difficult. It's not to say that those sites aren't out there, and I would certainly welcome comments at the end and suggestions for how to find those much harder to find and rarer sites. But focusing on the more prevalent sites associated with enslaved families, the first thing to locate is the associated plantation. And usually in terms of locating a burial ground on a plantation, the easiest cemetery to locate is going to be the cemetery associated with the white owner, the plantation owner. So here on the right-hand side, these are mostly examples from Albemarle County, Amherst County in Central Virginia, where I live and work. So on the right-hand side, this is a very typical plantation cemetery associated with the plantation, early 19th century plantation in Albemarle. The classic marble obelisk, the iron gate. It's a little hard to tell from this photo, but it is also up on a hill, and it is surrounded by these boxwood hedges. You can see this cemetery when you are going 60 miles per hour on Route 29 down below. In fact, that's how I first saw it. And because just next to it, about less than 1/8 of a mile away, is the old Big House, a big red brick building, and in association, again, even without stopping the car, you can be pretty certain that this is that plantation cemetery. Now, what is harder to locate, in fact, for this particular site, the honest truth is I have not yet located it, would be the associated slave cemetery. And this is complicated for a number of reasons. First, slave cemeteries are usually located further away from the Big House, sometimes as far away as 1 mile to 2 miles in some cases. And if you have a plantation that was originally 500, 1,000, 2,000 acres, that slave cemetery could be located anywhere on that acreage. And although sometimes the slave cemeteries are also located on high rises for sacred and symbolic reasons. So here on the left-hand side, this image is from a slave cemetery in northwestern Albemarle County. The slave cemetery is up on the top of that hill in that what is today very dense forest. You can probably tell from looking at these pictures, these trees are all new growth trees. They're certainly not original growth. they're roughly 50 years old. These trees were not standing during the antebellum period. During the antebellum period, this would have been a denuded hilltop, and it originally would have started out probably being used by a handful of families, and by the end, this cemetery contained over 100 graves. These graves are, some of them are unmarked, but the ones that are marked with simple field stones that would be very easily overlooked if you were looking for that more, what you might have in your mind's eye, the 19th century marble obelisks and associated funerary markers. To give you another example, this is from the Green Level Plantation, which is today the Avoca Museum in Avoca, Virginia. And on the right-hand side, this gives you some sense. This was a clump of trees in the center of a field. Anytime you find trees still growing in the center of a pasture field or a wheat field, you're going to want to look into that cluster of trees, because no farmer is going to want to willingly give up a circle in the middle of their field. It's obviously tremendously inconvenient to go around it. Very often that's associated with a burial ground, and in Virginia, more often than not, that is associated with, the land goes back to the antebellum period, associated with a plantation burial ground for enslaved families. So working our way through, and I told someone right before the talk, I now no longer look for these cemeteries in the summer or the spring or the early fall, and try to reserve a handful of days in January when the ticks and the bugs and the bears and the snakes and the overgrowth and the poison ivy is at a minimum in this state. So on the left-hand side, when we waded through there, all the orange flags are associated with different stones, and what should immediately be suspicious about this grouping is that when people bury human bodies, they do not bury them in clusters all stuck together. I mean, you obviously need space for the actual burial. So when I saw this, they clearly looked like they had once been markers, but I started asking through collecting oral history as to how they ended up in this particular configuration. And back in the 1960s, a farmer who had been using this field for his cows kept tripping over these stones. And so in the interest of his cows, he picked all the stones up and moved them to either side. This is one half of the cemetery. There were two larger trees in this cemetery, and he moved them to the base of these trees for his livestock. This is not an uncommon occurrence that, again, in this case, he certainly knowingly did this. He knew that it had been a cemetery because he was of an age, and because of the tight-knit community, the oral memory was still alive that this was a cemetery. Now, obviously, many more decades had passed, and it took us a little bit of time to relocate this site, which is why it's so important to proactively go out into your communities, especially with continuing development and construction, to locate these sites, get them onto the deeds, report them to your local communities, to the development offices, so that people have no excuse for building on them. The other thing to look for if you're searching for these cemeteries would be ecological clues, clues from the landscape itself. So here on the right-hand side, one of the plantings that are common, especially in immediate postbellum black cemeteries, but also in antebellum cemeteries, are these yucca plants. These are a non-native species. They are very popular in the 19th century, not just for cemeteries, they're also associated with house sites. So I certainly wouldn't, it's not that every time you see this, it has to be an African-American cemetery, but if you're otherwise walking, this area on the right is is cleared and taken care of today, so it wasn't as hard to locate the cemetery. But if you're looking through the woods, looking for one of these antebellum cemeteries, yucca plants are a very good indication of some human presence. And one of the explanations I had for these years ago when I asked someone why this particular plant, as you would know if you've actually stood next to one of them, they have that very sharp top, they're spiky. And they said that was so that if the devil came to visit, he wouldn't want to sit down. Better that than poison ivy. So on the left-hand side, you can see the pattern I mentioned before. And I should say in this slide, I realize every time I show it that in the upper left-hand corner, what you're looking at, now I can't remember if those are little sheep or cattle or bushes, but those are not the gravestones. The gravestones are here. These are the gravestones. They're uninscribed. There are no names. There are no dates. I've studied several thousand slave gravestones. About 5% have inscriptions. Now, this pattern might change in different regions of Virginia for different historic time periods. If I have not done a lot of work on slave cemeteries in urban areas. I mean, unlike the New York, the Manhattan burial ground. So there might be an increase in inscriptions in urban sites, but in these rural areas in central Virginia, it is very rare that they are inscribed. And this is one of the reasons why it's so complicated for people to locate them, appreciate their significance, and realize that we can still learn from them, even though they're not the traditional genealogical gold mine that a standard cemetery is with inscriptions. Here are two more examples of why looking at that environmental landscape and the associated botany is so important. On the left-hand side, these are tulips that are being planted. I should say that the colorful flowers are plastic, those are fake. But those are also obviously an important indication that you have above ground offerings. And then that little marker that you see that looks like a picture frame, these are handed out by funeral homes still to this day. That obviously would indicate a postbellum grave. But very often, postbellum graves can be associated with people who were enslaved and lived after emancipation, or a slave cemetery that was later or continuously used by families after emancipation. So certainly to keep your eye open for those funeral markers. Unfortunately, and as is the case here, it's a piece of paper with glass in front of it. They don't last very long. They're meant to be a temporary marker while you save up the money for the permanent marker, but in many cases, people never got to that point, so this remains the permanent marker, and very often they're legible. On the right-hand side, this is an unmarked grave. If there was originally a marker, it was perhaps wood, maybe it was a planting, maybe it was a tree. Today there's nothing left, but as you can clearly see, if you look for these cemeteries in the late fall, early spring, the leaves have differentially settled because there is a slight depression, and the leaves are showing you where that depression is, and that would be the location of the actual burial. It's the same thing happens with snow, with newly fallen snow. So I've spent the last 12 years researching African American cemeteries more broadly, and then also more specifically antebellum cemeteries. And these are just some of the research questions that have guided my work, and I'm not going to have time to answer them all here. But these are questions to consider if you're studying these cemeteries in your communities or if you have access to archival documentation. It is much rarer in the archives, letters, diaries, newspapers from the antebellum period. It is not unheard of, but it is rare to find descriptions of these cemeteries. And there's only a handful of descriptions, of contemporary descriptions of what the funerals look like. So that makes oral histories and collecting oral histories very, very, very valuable. And also talking with families and descendants of these communities to see if they have photographs, any items that connected to mourning traditions. In the 19th century, mourning was a very important aspect of commemorating the dead. You know, women were expected to wear black for, in the famous case of Queen Victoria, almost until her death. Decades after the death of her consort and husband. And in this case, in the upper left-hand corner, these are two uninscribed stones. It is a headstone and a footstone, and although the scale might be a little hard to see here, this is the burial of a child. So even when they're not inscribed, if you have a head and footstone, that is a pattern that changes diachronically. So you don't, just because you have a headstone doesn't mean there is a footstone, but when there is, that can give you a very good sense of whether it's an adult or a child. Now you can't, obviously because of variation in height, it's not much more specific than that. For example, a subadult or a juvenile as opposed to a child, but it can give you some sense of who's buried there. And some of the interesting research questions are how, and it goes back to what both Dr. Newby Alexander was mentioning and Dr. Blakey, how did enslaved people, given the inhumanity of slavery, what were the techniques and strategies that they used to regain their humanity and regain control of their lives? And certainly one of the ways is through mortuary rituals. Although the archival record is a little bit sparse, it seems clear from what has been recorded that it is very rare that the owners of the plantations took control of African American funerary practices, or to put it the other way, they gave African Americans the freedom to bury their dead within certain parameters. So for example, many slave funerals occurred at midnight. And midnight was selected for a number of reasons. One is that was one of the only times during the day that a majority of the enslaved population would be free from work. And the second reason goes back to West African traditions, where midnight, because it's considered a liminal time, it's neither day nor night, it's a transition. So it's symbolically and religiously a very important moment for a passing on or a transition. And this was certainly in many enslaved communities, this tradition was continued. But it still left the challenge of, as we know, during slavery, families were very often separated over, I mean, if not states, but certainly over surrounding plantations having to do with inheritance patterns. And when this happened, if you had a relative who died, and maybe a close relative, like a spouse or a child, on another plantation, how did you arrange permission to travel, even if it was only a couple miles away when you don't most likely have access to a horse, and you're working from sunup to sunset, is a challenge. And this is all part of what enslaved peoples were trying to surmount in terms of being able to remember their dead, commemorate their dead, and mark the remains of where these people were buried. As I mentioned, there are a handful of examples of drawings and almost contemporary accounts of slavery. This particular example, it was published in 1881, but it's remembering back to a slave funeral. And the quote here is from the author, who was a white author who observed this. It mentions a tradition of burying as close to midnight as possible. But what is fascinating about this image, if you look at it carefully, first off, it clearly is taking place at night. The person in the front has a torch. And if you look at the coffin, it's hexagonal, which is a little bit unusual. It's not unheard of in the 19th century, but that is a fancier coffin. In many cases, enslaved people probably were buried in shrouds because they couldn't either most likely afford the time to make a coffin, let alone if they had to purchase it. So in this case, it's actually a very fancy coffin. And if you also notice the detail, the person carrying the torch in the front has a shovel at his side. And then you can see the grave, the opened grave down here. They've opened up a grave, and then this person is symbolically, with a stick, brushing clean where the coffin, the procession is coming right before the grave. So it's a fascinating scene, even though it's somewhat simple in its drawing. So moving to some of the gravestones that I've located in my study in Central Virginia. And here I am going to show some of the inscribed stones. And for a variety of reasons, these inscriptions, sometimes they're fairly straightforward, and then sometimes I certainly myself do not yet have the answer for how to interpret fully the inscription. So on the left-hand side, it might be a little hard to see, but the name that is inscribed is almost certainly Betsy, but it's not a typo in the heading. If you look at it very closely, the number 8 is the best way to indicate the symbol that they drew instead of an S. It's not an S, and it's not just a backwards S. It's an S, I mean, it's basically an 8. And I cannot explain to you whether or not that the 8 had some symbolic value or that they were misrepresenting the letter S. I can tell you that in 1831, the state of Virginia passed a law that made it illegal to teach slaves to read and write. This was in part a concern over slave revolts and rebellions, and white lawmakers hoped that by making it harder for enslaved people to learn how to read and write, it would be much harder to organize these, what they considered insurrections. So in some cases, these inscriptions, they might be copying down something. It might be someone who's not themselves literate, but they're copying down, either they've asked someone to write the word Betsy for them, and then they're going to copy the gravestone later, or they're taking it from something else, a newspaper, something where they know that this is the name that they want to represent. I will also point out that this is a beautifully carved stone. It's slightly subtle, but instead of just being one of these unmodified field stones that's common in slave cemeteries, this one has this ornate, what is very common in the 19th century in both white and black cemeteries, post-bell and black cemeteries, common carving style. On the right-hand side, this is not inscribed, but it is beautifully carved into that hourglass, somewhat anthropomorphic shape. And then this is a fascinating gravestone, and I will be happy to share this image with anyone who wants to spend a couple hours trying to figure out what it says. I have already spent dozens of hours that am not very much closer. On the left-hand side is the stone. This is on a plantation in Albemarle County owned by the Carter family. And the Carter family is fascinating. One of the Carters freed his slaves and went on to be the governor of Illinois, but this is obviously the family that stayed behind. So obviously you have these pre-carved lines to help someone, to make sure that the inscription is straight, and then a tremendously lengthy inscription. Occasionally it appears to be dates, certainly 1848 seems to be clear, but I also want to call your attention on the first line, it's 1858, and then it looks like the letter D and possibly AMMA or ANNA or some variation thereof. And that variation of A, an M or an N and an A is repeated on this stone. And interestingly, down in Texas, I don't know if any of you have read, was a popular book that came out a number of years ago by China Galland on the Love Cemetery down in Texas. And she recently sent me a photograph of one of the inscribed stones that was not, they had not found that cemetery, like many of these cemeteries, is so overgrown. She and working with community members have continued to spend years and years and years cleaning and recleaning the site. And in the process, they found a new stone. And here, although it looks more like AMA, it's certainly quite a coincidence as this combination of letters is appearing in obviously unrelated communities across a wide geographic area. And one interpretation I had for it, but again, during Q&A, I'm happy to take other ideas, was that it had to do with the Latin for anno, that had something to do with year, because in the inscription here, it co-occurs with certainly something that could be a date. So these stones, when they are inscribed, certainly are very rich in terms of trying to interpret them. But I would also caution you that in some cases, the memorials of enslaved individuals were commissioned, paid for, and were erected by their owners or former owners. And then that's telling us a different kind of story. So here on the left-hand side, to read it just in case you can't read the smaller print, it's the following Negroes are buried under these stones. It lists 5 individuals, men and women, and it was erected in April of 1929. This is connected with a plantation in Albemarle County, and this is someone who these individuals died at different time periods after emancipation, but they were originally enslaved. Now on the right-hand side, it's going to be very hard to read the stone, but the stone that I'm referring to is the small one in front, and behind that stone are the memorials of the family who enslaved her, the Meade family, and in the front, that stone simply reads, Hagar, faithful servant. And this is a pattern that you find on memorials to both people who died during slavery and then people who lived after emancipation but who had been enslaved. And I mean, the irony, or I don't even know what the best word for this is, but the faithful servant, who now the former white owner is commemorating in death, and their commemoration is them now for eternity as a servant who's faithful, is such a passive way to remember someone. And you also have to keep in mind that here Hagar, up at the top, I have her full name and when she was born. But this I found out by doing actually a bit of research, because otherwise the only thing I had to go from is her first name. It's Hagar Newton, and she was employed after emancipation by this family and then enslaved prior to emancipation. But none of her family members are here. And you really do have to question when you see memorials like this, and sometimes they have the rather, well, if nothing else, paternalistic prefix of Aunt Jane or Uncle so-and-so. And they're not surrounded by their family, and the monument is erected by a former owner or a contemporary employer after the Civil War. And you just have to wonder if the person buried, did they ask to be buried with their former owner and their family? And or did they want to be buried with their kin? So it's kind of a double-edged sword when people are commemorated in this way. And an interesting example of this, in the upper left-hand corner on letter A, this, as you can remember from the first slide, this is a different plantation, but the exact same pattern. Wrought iron fence, obelisks. This is the plantation owner's cemetery. On the right-hand side, you have the obelisk. That's one of the patriarchs of the family, of the white family. But I want to call your attention to this stone right here, the slightly smaller stone. This is the stone in C. And again, this is one of these paternalistic adages, the mammy. This is obviously not what Sarah Jordan called herself. But this woman was born during slavery in 1819. She lived many decades after emancipation. And again, it has one of these inscriptions, faithful unto death. And then in D, this very curious cairn of rocks, the stone that's right here that you can't read very well here, and okay, arguably you can't read very well here either, but this is the stone right here in front of the cairn. And if you could read it, it would say, in memory of the colored people who lived and worked at Sunnybank in 1790, and then not a dot, 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 but a long hyphen with no end date. And the reason for this, because I was working at the plantation and talking with the owners today who are descended from this 19th century family, their father in the 1950s, well, two things happened in the 1950s. One, all those rocks you see in that cairn, I should point out that while cairn burials are popular, they're really more popular in Europe. I mean, there are cultures that use mound burials, but it's not very common in the 19th century among European American or African American communities, in Virginia anyhow. Well, that cairn, each one of those stones is a gravestone, an individual gravestone that was originally on one person's grave. And it was distributed over this area of the field. Well, in the 1950s, the owners just thought that it kind of looked ugly. I mean, they weren't in rows, they weren't aligned, they were uninscribed, and they thought it would be a better memorial for their aesthetic vision if it were shaped like a pyramid. So they took up all those stones and made a pyramid. And then they erected this stone. At this point, of course, they've now erased kind of the individual humanity of each of the burials, but they have added an inscription that at least tells us who these people are who were buried here, and the bodies are still, they did not disturb any of the human remains, but they disturbed the markers, and again created kind of a new cultural tradition in the process, which as an anthropologist, we don't like it when people do that. That makes it very confusing to interpret the original ritual significance for the community that buried their dead. And then the last part of this story, the ending, it's a little hard to tell, but this is a beautiful needlepoint that was commissioned for a birthday celebration. And it's very idealized and romanticized, and everything's symmetrical, and they're really clean, animals. This isn't, what a real barnyard animals would look like. And then off here, this is the family cemetery, the one right here, and the needle pointer added in that cairn and that monument. She did everything. She took it from a photograph, and she wouldn't have known what she was doing. So now it is commemorated both on the ground, but also through this needle point. Eternity would be a little long, but for a very long time, as part of the sacred landscape. So you never know. Sometimes, even though usually it's the opposite case, that slave cemeteries are not very well marked on maps, in historic records and documents, sometimes they show up in the strangest places. And I have to say, this needlepoint is the strangest place I've ever seen one documented so far. So in my last couple minutes, to show you some other things that you can do to interpret a site even when you don't have inscribed stones. This is a slave cemetery at Sweetbriar College where I work. Sweetbriar used to be a plantation. In 1860, there were over 120 enslaved men, women, and children. It was one of the largest plantations in Amherst County at the time. This is the slave cemetery. Not one stone is inscribed, but the blue clusters that you see here, this is my interpretation of clear patternings and associated stones that may correspond to kinship groups, or they may correspond to different chronological periods of burials. So the patterning of these gravestones, graveyards, even though they're not in lines, maybe they don't look orderly, they still can tell us a lot about family relationships and connections and what those families and people were intending by their burial patterns. Examples of these gravestones, these are the gravestones that were on that image I showed you at the beginning, and this is just to encourage you to be optimistic so that when you find these sites and you think, oh, this can't be a gravestone, there's no date, it's not carved into any recognizable shape. Look for patterns. If you have many of these and in association with depressions, you found a cemetery. And this cemetery, just to give you a sense of its scale, as I mentioned, there were over 100 burials. And although it took a lot of time to map all of this, When I did, what you see in A, which just looks like completely disorganized burials, are actually organized to the cardinal directions, to east and west, facing, so that when you rise up again, you're facing to the east. The most important part of this map is in C. The reason why I have the two different areas is that there's a different orientation in these two areas, and that, to me at least, suggests that this burial ground was used over multiple generations, and that a younger generation set out in a new location, and their orientations were slightly different. Keep in mind, no one here is using a compass to find east, so you have to be doing it depending what season you start your burials. And then, last but not least, here on that we're on a college campus, the University of Virginia has a slave cemetery, and to give you a sense of its location, this green rectangle is the Scott Stadium, the football stadium at UVA. So it's not like this is in a hard-to-find place, but yet it has almost disappeared off the modern landscape. This is one of the reasons why we need a project like this to remind people that these sites are all around us. Certainly in Central Virginia and Albemarle County in 1860, both enslaved and free black African Americans were more than 50% of the population. So they were not a statistical minority. And so that means that anywhere you're seeing white graves and gravestones, somewhere are the corresponding gravestones for African Americans. It's just harder to find them. So this slave cemetery, a picture of it today is up there. It is located, they built a dorm around it because they were trying to avoid it. They refound the cemetery in 1984. There are no standing memorials left today. And then this is the marker that they chose. Unfortunately, the way it's designed, it looks like it's a bench. And so when I went to look for this, I spent a couple hours asking people who lived in these dorms and who walked by this bench 1,000 times and probably sat on that bench and hadn't noticed that on the side of the bench is the marker that says this area contains unmarked graves believed to be those of the slaves of the Maury family, owners of Piedmont in the 19th century, University of Virginia in 1984. So in conclusion, I have about 4,000 gravestones available online. These are gravestones that I've located mostly in Albemarle and Amherst County. On the website, the URL is down in the lower right-hand corner, but even if you're not looking for relatives or information from those counties, I am more than happy to share the template of this site, which is organized by locating a cemetery, learning about the cemetery, and then clicking on each individual stone and getting that biographical information about these people so that we can remember them moving forward and not forget the location of their burial sites. And last but not least, I work with teachers a lot, teachers of K through 12 students, to make sure that the next generation knows about these sites. Because as we all know, for whatever the average age is in this room, that if we don't pass this knowledge on to the next generation, everything that we've done today and all of our reports and memories will just be cataloged and filed away somewhere, and that will not be helping protect these sites into the future. So I hope that everyone has a chance to look deeper in their own communities for where these sites are and call their location to the attention of your local counties and planning departments. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rainville. Well, we have now two informative and thought-provoking presentations. First of our discussants.
Hi, I'd like to thank you, first of all, for coming out and sharing this morning with us on such a lovely day. My research has been centered on Gloucester County, Virginia. And to pick up on a point Dr. Rainville made as she was closing, in many of Virginia's counties, particularly in the Tidewater area, African Americans, for most of the state's history, actually constituted a majority of the population. And yet, in modern times, there seems to be a serious scarcity of physical evidence of their presence as enslaved populations, and unfortunately, due to the early migration outward that ended perhaps in about 1920. Some would argue it didn't end until the 1960s and only recently began to reverse. a number of different types of sites were left behind. This is Shiloh. This is a church that sits in Gloucester County. It's an early 20th century structure. The congregation worshiped there for a couple of decades, but the location is challenging. It is in the extreme eastern part of the county. It is not too far from a major cluster of plantations. The land that was allowed for the structure itself is indeed quite limited. And as you can see, it has been abandoned for quite some time. A walk around the property as far as one can go to avoiding, this is Shiloh again, but this is 8 miles distant. This is where the cemetery is located. 8 miles distant. As you can tell, this is a shot from the roadbed. And as you can see, to the casual passerby, there's nothing there. There's nothing there. This is not a very good shot. I had to reshoot it yesterday. And as you can see, it is grossly overgrown now, not being maintained. And the local ministerial alliance has discussed attempting to get other congregations to come in and attempt to clear the site, make it more noticeable, and in that way perhaps secure it a little bit more. But as of yet, no final decision has been made. This is another site. This is a burial that's found at a fairly well-known and historically validated African-American church in Gloucester County. This is in the graveyard at Zion Poplars Baptist Church. Zion Poplar has the reputation of being the oldest independent or free African-American congregation in the county's history. They take their name from a very unusual poplar tree that occupies the site. The tree has 7 trunks. And according to oral tradition, the congregants worshiped under the multi-trunked poplar tree prior to creating their edifice, building their building. One of the, as you can see, that these are board markers. They are cedar. Cedar is a very important wood in African-American burials, particularly in the early burials after emancipation. Cedar is a hard wood, long-lasting, weathers well. Cedar is also what many African-Americans would consider to be a biblical wood. Wrong direction. This is actually a photo of the same burial. This would be the headstone. Here's the footer now. It's collapsed. This is one of the problems that we are confronting, not just in the pursuit of slave burials, but how do we document and to some degree stabilize these impermanent markers that we find. Photography is a beginning, but once again, if these were ever inscribed, time, weather have worn away any possibility of recovering specific identities. Here's another far, far older, apparently, cedar marker. This one is located in a another Gloucester cemetery known as Pole Bridge. This is located in the Ware Neck area. It's part of a field that has a large number of what are commonly referred to as vernacular markers, but they have in common that there is no data that's made available to a researcher other than the physical form itself. Though this is in a clearly marked and established and supported church burial field, there are a number of examples of simple, uninscribed field stones, much like those that Dr. Rainville has documented in the slave cemeteries that she's been working with. Cedar Creek. The first time I saw this oak tree, I kind of knew. The first time, and as Dr. Rainville said, when you pass a field that's otherwise been planted with crops of various types, and yet either at the very edge of it or in the very center of it, there is a striking individual tree or a small co of trees. There's something about them that sort of pulls you to them. This particular tree is fascinating in that not only is it a marker of a African American burial field, it's also a marker of cooperation between the races. The tree is located on privately held land that's been in private hands since the early 1700s. The families that have controlled the land have changed over time, but all of the owners have been white. It is currently in the ownership of the Robbins family. The cemetery that includes this oak tree is a post-emancipation burial field. Oral tradition has it that it began in the late 1880s and was begun by an African American elder, a female, who asked the owners of the plantation that she had once been enslaved upon if she could be buried there to be with her ancestors, with those who had preceded her in her family. The Robbins family, who owned it then, gave her permission, and several other individuals over time made similar requests, all of which were complied with. The field has been maintained. That is a capstone right at the foot of the oak tree in that photograph. The family has maintained the property. At one time, when they kept cattle on the land, they fenced the burial field. They have worked with a local black church to do a ceremonial removal of grave dirt to be reburied at the daughter church cemetery. Fascinating thing about this area is it's all located in what's known as Guinea, a place in which, even in the county, the local history is that there were no blacks in the Guinea area. Well, Guinea is not only apparently a continuing home of some interesting African American history, but it's a location in which a mother church that was white, that listed its deacons in 1844 by name and owner, has given birth to a daughter church that is historically black, that lists those same deacons as their founders, and the two churches are not separated by much more than a half mile. They continue to exchange choirs and pastors unto this day. The problem for me in Gloucester has been a problem of ownership. Who owns the legacy of enslavement and freedom? Who's willing to discuss it? Who actually owns the sites in which these individuals are buried? In some cases, the burials are indeed on private property. This requires some thought, some discussion, eventually some negotiation between various elements of the community to see if we can access these locations. And most of all, who owns the history? I mean, who determines how it is used? Communities, families, congregations, all should be drawn into this conversation. There are roles that we as academics and scholars can fulfill and can fulfill wonderfully. But in my case, in Gloucester County, Virginia, I'm a come here. I'm an outsider. I need others in the community, as do we all. We need people in the communities, in the churches, in the schools, to take some ownership here, to help by being responsible for helping us to teach the value of what it is that we are attempting to preserve. I thank you for your time.
I decided today, as a kind of summary, to just look at some of the images that you'll find when you Google cemeteries in Virginia, because it's a kind of sampling. So I kind of threw out last night all the things from my own research, except one, for the end, just to try to review with you a bit some of the efforts of different types that are out there. However, this lady is not from Virginia. She is on one of the many national sites for cemetery preservation groups that are local and working within their areas. I just thought her sign was appropriate for today. Part of the construction of sacred space as sacred, I think, comes also out of a kind of larger tradition of the idea of the cemetery as a place apart when the cemetery is preserved. But if you look closely, this is from Wilmington, North Carolina. But it has a lot. The cemetery was founded in the 1770s. And it has a lot of vessels on the graves. Now, one of the things that I did about 20 years ago was go very, very closely down the cemeteries of the Eastern Shore, which is part of the same strip. I wasn't looking for antebellum cemeteries. I was looking at visiting African American cemeteries, talking to the people at the churches where I stopped along the way. And what I saw were the remnants of the vessels that had been often broken by lawnmowers or changes in fashion. They were just more apparent then. And also, I think we have to deal with the idea that people want to be modern. They don't necessarily want things, these offerings were written about in ways that describe them as backward. A lot of that writing was by white folklorists. But they also got left behind when churches moved, which is just a more dynamic process, that people would build a bigger building. And also they were out there for the weather. But people still make offerings, and I think it's really important to remember that one of the things that people do is keep the spirit of what they do the same, but update the objects that they use in an offering. So in the older days, might symbolize water, the passage over the water through a mirror, and now a Mylar balloon from the supermarket, and maybe not even put into words that water thing, but just know that something that stands out in that way is the appropriate thing to do. So this is that cemetery now. These are, just as a reminder going into our discussion, Dr. Blakey's main issues that we can be thinking about as we move toward a conversation. Humanity, how is humanity made? How, or reaffirmed, affirmed, cemeteries and forms of resistance, which I think you've already seen with the lady with her sign, that the resistance is ongoing. Reinforcement and bringing together a family, history, and then I also am adding a little more emphasis today on making sacred space. And I think one of the ways that people make sacred space is simply by insisting on naming, which is a way of claiming and humanity, claiming personhood, claiming space. And this is, I noticed, got a quote from the Washington Post for a photograph where the name of the deceased is clearly written, and the Post writes, "Someone is buried here." You know, let's do a little work. This is part of a good thing of noting where the cemeteries are, and yet it reiterates the themes of history that we've been hearing about. Unmarked, closed in 1880, persons purportedly moved. Who knows? This was a case also on the web where coal companies simply buried people by number. So there's a family memory. And I have to say, you know, with the stones and from the plantation era and the lack of writing, that I don't think people back then are writing and literacy are one of my main interests. And unlike most people, I know that there is a very strong drive to literacy and education. But one of the things that I studied was where in spiritual context, people preferred, African Americans often, a more kind of direct sense of the spirit. And even though completely literate, sometimes highly educated, would opt not to use writing in those times. Also, one of the notions of ancestors that's very old is that, that as people pass from memory of the living, they pass into the state of ancestors. And so when the people who knew who were buried there are no longer living, they're all with ancestors, and it doesn't matter what their names were because they're in the new zone of power. And I'm going to, that affects the living through their strength in this world as a collective. And then, you know, just this unmarked again. One of the things that I've been interested in for the last 25 years is personal memorials that individuals make to the ancestors, and included with that enslaved ancestors. And I'll be coming to that in a moment. But one of the reasons for that is that ancestors are part of the foundation of a home place. But another one is that that cemeteries themselves pass away. And for those of you who are interested in African patterns, one of the patterns across a number of cultures is to let the forest retake the space in the same pattern. But these are just reminders of some of the efforts to name on a grassroots level that are going on all around, and usually with them are cleanup efforts. A family cemetery, just a reminder of free black cemeteries when they do survive, of the conflicts that are recorded. And, you know, there is this dynamic where, and I don't know if that's true here, but where white neo-Confederates are memorializing African American soldiers for the Confederacy, some of whom were soldiers for the Confederacy, and some of them had absolutely no options whatsoever about who they were enslaved to and where they were taken. So they're very complicated stories with all of these. But the fact is that that's a person who had these experiences and who at least his name, Richard Poplar, is known. The efforts to get recognition long after the fact. So Buffalo Soldier being interred at Arlington Cemetery 100 years later. And then just to some reminders about space. I think sometimes when we talk about material things, graves, cemeteries, you know, we've been reminded today of the efforts in the present and also in the past of great celebrations and parades, but a lot of the activity is very personal and starts with profound grief and prayer. And one of the things that makes cemeteries above all sacred is all the prayer that is around them and the spirit of people who bring their grief and take it forward from that place. So that but also in this cemetery, which is not in Virginia, it's from a book called Deep South, and the people in it are unidentified. But you can see something that has persisted in Virginia, which is to mark off the graves with something white, with white as the color of day. You know, so Queen Victoria wore black, but that's not necessarily what we would expect a mourning African American to wear, or what we would expect on the ground. So it makes the space clean. The closer to the coast you are, the more sand coverings you will see. And finally, there's a good reason in Virginia, as we've seen, not necessarily to trust your ancestors and their memory to a cemetery, but to instead memorialize the ancestors in your own home place that you were founding. And so, you know, a lot of people think that everything from Africa has somehow died out from Virginia, and then I get people when I give a talk who say, oh, well, he must have read this, how to do this in a book by Robert Ferris Thompson or something. Well, I promise you, he did not. This is Mr. William Winston. I'm sorry to say that he has passed, but I am glad to have been privileged to know him a bit when he was living. He was about 81 at the time I took this picture in 98. And he lived in Charles City County. And his family is buried in a Baptist church cemetery that was very well cared for and still is very near where he lived. But he wanted to make a personal memorial. And what you see is his committed Christianity manifesting in ways, I mean, I am not in any way, shape, or form experts on African American people. But I have some expertise in white people. And I know when I see something that is not part of the burial practices or home commemorations of most of the white people I have known. And I also have had the privilege to travel and see the recurring patterns in African American commemoration. And one of them is something that probably is quite widespread, but I do know that it's often written about in Central Africa. The notion of special pieces of wood as revealing to us the hand of God in creation. And in this case, Mr. Winston also told me that that these trees, he felt, were shaped like sheltering hands. And if you think, so you have to look at the things that are also for much more contemporary, like the praying hands statue that so many people have, just the notion of sheltering hands. A lot of times when you see something like this where there appears to be a bench, it's not a bench, it's the Lord's table. And that's another one of the recurring motifs, that the ancestors of the family are gathered around God's table now. And the well and the waters of the Holy Spirit, but also the waters that people cross over. But the waters of the Holy Spirit through the ancestors continually pour back into our lives. And then down at the bottom, another recurring motif, which is an idea of the soul. This comes into one place you can see this a lot is in conversion narratives. The most famous of them, written down by African American researchers from Fisk University interviewing formerly enslaved people during the 1930s in a book that is called God Struck Me Dead. And one of the things that recurs over and over is that the soul becomes a little white being, sometimes a little white man. But I've also seen the notion of the soul when the soul is to be reborn in the next world as a small white animal. And in Virginia, I've also seen people with old graves, handmade dolls, as well as other kinds of dolls on graves that are not of children. Or a cherub, little bitty cherub, next to a larger statue of Jesus, so that Jesus is the guide who is leading the small soul over. So in this case, there are two guardian watchdogs who look out at you, just making sure that your gaze meets the gaze of protection that comes from this place. So Mr. Winston, I think one of the important things is that, the European culture separates everything into parts. You all know that dancing and music are not such separate things. Places like this are part of a wider life. The things that Dr. Newby Alexander told us about bring cemeteries back into continuing wider life. Well, Mr. Winston's role, one of his roles, since he was retired at this point, was counseling young people. So when I drove up, I was with Wyone Edwards Ingram, who is an archaeologist at Colonial Williamsburg, and when we arrived, there were a whole bunch of young men with their bicycles parked around with Mr. Winston, and he was counseling them on women. So, it moves on out into the problems of everyday life, and I thank you very much. These are some of the things that he used. I forgot I had these. You can see that is a bottle tree that he made, an old tradition. A couple more. I forgot about all these. Let me go back. So I'm hoping that you'll share with us your own experiences of insisting on the humanity of family, people now, ancestors, and history.